Recorded at Get a Grip Studios in Toronto, Canada. A Get a Grip management production and in association with the Get a Grip on Lighting podcast. Financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors and presented by the National Lighting Bureau, the Illuminating Engineering Society, and the International Dark Sky Association. Added to the IES's 2021 Progress Report. This is Starving for Darkness, a podcast. Hey folks, Starving for Darkness is coming in hot in 1 second. Jane's ready to go, I know that. And you guys are ready to listen. But before we do, we got to talk about Evluma, the people that sponsor this show, the magicians. evluma.com. Hover over products, click Dark Sky Friendly, and hit up that Omnimax, Greg.
And why you do that is because the OmniMax can fit in just about every existing outdoor fixture that's out there. It's a retrofit bulb itself, and it has a Kelvin temperatures from 2K up to 5K, medium and multiple base, 20 kV to 10 Ka surge protection, has a photo control fail-safe, which if your photocell goes out, this bulb, we'll call it, learns it over time, and then it will mimic whatever that photocell did. So it knows what it needs to do without the expense of having to go and replace the photocell. And all of it's in a compact size, so it's going to fit in your existing fixture.
Go to evluma.com, hover over products, click on Dark Sky Friendly Lighting. God, they're doing it so right. Check them out, evluma.com. Now, here comes Starving for Darkness.
Hello, listeners and darkness lovers. Welcome to another episode of Starving for Darkness. My name is Jane Slade, and I'm here, and I'm thrilled to have our next guest, Dr. Micah Brodsky. Dr. Brodsky is a wildlife veterinarian and pioneer in the fields of marine mammal and sea turtle research and medicine, and holds a doctorate in veterinary medicine from UPenn. He is the Director of Conservation Medicine and Director of Development at Hawaiʻi Marine Animal Response. I'll call that HMAR throughout the episode, and brings more than 15 years of experience in wildlife medicine to his role as HMAR's veterinarian. Micah, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm particularly excited because I think by now our listeners know I absolutely love wildlife. So I really can't wait to dig into your expertise. And we start every episode with the same request. Would you please tell us about a dark sky experience that left you with a feeling of awe?
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation having me on, Jane.
Absolutely.
I would be happy to tell you about an experience, a dark sky experience that left me with a sense of awe. And I think my first really profound dark sky experience was in the summer after my freshman year of college. I was fortunate enough to spend about 3 months living in a tent on the rural coast of Newfoundland. Now, for a kid who grew up in Philadelphia and had really never spent any time outside of an urbanized landscape, being in this incredibly remote area with functionally zero light pollution was mind-boggling. I spent many nights just laying on my back, looking up at the stars and at the sky and marveling at this incredibly bright, vivid, colorful sky. And the other thing that really struck me about that was how incredibly cold it could get on a summer night in Newfoundland with the wind coming off the bay. But there was something that's really stuck with me during that time, which was how good the nighttime visibility was for all but maybe three or four nights of the month. And so we basically had no need for and didn't use artificial lighting at night for most of the month when we were living out there. And that has really stayed with me. And I have since relocated to much warmer climates. I live in Hawaii now. And we still, like today in our home, we have no lighting on at night. So all the exterior lights are out. The interior lights we burn. We shut off lights we're not using, primarily to try and maintain that darkness. Now, I'm very fortunate to live in kind of a rural area in Hawaii as well, on Oahu, which is the most densely
Mhm.
populated island. And we live on a street that has no street lights, and you can still see, we still have fairly good visibility for the night sky by comparison to where we lived prior to this, which was on the town side of the island, which is much densely.
Mhm. So I'm curious, were you referring to those darker nights as the new moon nights when you couldn't see?
Yes, that would be primarily that would occur around new moons or nights when there was a lot of cloud cover.
Hmm. And I find it interesting also, you know, I we've all grown up with devices, and that there you were separated from all of these screens, even probably back then, and you were just completely magnetically attracted to the screen of the sky. And I've often said the sky was our first screen, and that it's anything but boring. You don't feel detached at all. In fact, it feels like a moment of connection. So I find it interesting the way you described just almost being addicted to going out and looking at those stars.
Well, for me, it was something novel, and you're right. We do all grow up uh, kind of with access to screens, and while I certainly watched television as a kid, I'm old enough that this was a decade and a half, I think, before I saw my first cell phone. So it was in some ways it was a major shift. In other ways, the only screen in my life up until that point had been either one of those green screens you see with a Commodore 64 or or a television.
Yeah. And I also have a practice where I really keep the lights out at night. And I find that it's almost an addiction because, and I hope for everyone else that it becomes an addiction too, that when you allow darkness to set in your space and you kind of allow that connection to the darkness that's happening outside, that if you turn a light on, you can't see or feel. So it's that, but it becomes a habit and a practice. So it's nice to see how those moments that you had in Newfoundland actually created almost a lifelong practice, it sounds.
Oh, it absolutely did create a lifelong practice. I have since that time, I have, although I have great neighbors now, historically have lived in a number of places where I had neighbors that had extremely bright lights, or I lived in urban areas with high light pollution, and I really found that I had a lot more difficulty sleeping without. If I didn't have blackout shades, that kind of pervasive all night bright light, especially turning on and off and on and off, I find it to be very disruptive, and I sleep a lot better when I don't have that kind of input.
Yeah, I was actually I had to go on a long drive this weekend, and I realized for the first time, and I haven't said this to anyone, so here you are, that light pollution is a terrible term because if you talk about air pollution, water pollution? Well, light pollution is referring back onto itself. So what we're actually talking about is sleep pollution, star pollution. That's the better term to really describe what's being polluted, not light. Light's the polluter. So it's kind of a weird term that actually we've discussed on the show doesn't even work. It doesn't work for people advocating for against light pollution, and also for people that are scared of the dark. It's also offensive. So there's a lot of problems with that term. And you're right, sleep is one of the main things that is affecting humans, but we're here to talk about wildlife today. And so you are
Absolutely.
the director of conservation medicine and director of development at HMAR. Is that how you guys say it? HMAR, HMAR?
I usually refer to it as HMAR.
HMAR. Okay. So that's easier to say for me as well. And so can
Great.
you talk about your role and the mission of this organization?
Sure. So, the mission of HMAR is to undertake significant action that preserves and helps recover the protected marine species in and around Hawaii, the marine ecosystem in Hawaii, and the ecosystem that humans and animals share. And so my role with the organization is obviously I wear a few different hats. So I work closely with the president and founder of the organization to maintain all of our permits and regulatory compliance. I work closely with all members of the staff to help train and train people's animal skills, their what kind of our protocols for how we approach and assess animals, and help to make sure that we're, as you and I were talking a little bit about nomenclature earlier, that we are using good nomenclature when we're collecting data, and that we're working closely with our partners at NOAA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife and other regulatory partners and sponsors to make sure that we're gathering really good quality information that can be used to more effectively help support the recovery and protection of the protected marine species that we work with.
Mm-hmm. According to your website, it says Hawaii makes up less than 0.2% of U.S. land, but over 25% of species found on the nation's endangered species list are endemic to Hawaii, earning it a rather unflattering title of the endangered species capital of the world. Can you talk about why there are so many endangered species in a remote part of the world?
Sure. So the vast majority of those species that are being referred to there are actually plant species. So there's
Wow.
some 300 plant species in the state of Hawaii that are listed on the endangered species list. Now, part of this is that when we talk about a species being threatened or endangered, here in the United States, what we're really speaking about or discussing is that those animals are listed on the Endangered Species Act, under the Endangered Species Act, which is ministered primarily by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There are some joint activities that go on between U.S. Fish and Wildlife and other government agencies such as NOAA Fisheries, but for the most part, it's U.S. Fish and Wildlife listing and maintaining that list of threatened or endangered species under the Endangered Species Act. And that can include both plants and animals. And it also helps to provide that legislative infrastructure, that legal infrastructure, helps to provide support for protecting the habitat that is critically important for those protected species. And so when we talk about the protected species that we here at HMAR work directly with, what we're really talking about is Hawaiian monk seals, dolphins and whales, which we fortunately here on Oahu, we have, there are not a lot of strandings. Dolphin and whale strandings do happen occasionally, but if we, in comparison to many of the other places in the US and around the world, we have very few dolphin and whale strandings here in Hawaii. And then sea turtles and seabirds. And while some of the seabirds are listed under the Endangered Species Act, a number of the seabirds that we work with are actually not protected under the ESA. They're protected under the Migratory Bird Species Act, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Which basically is an international agreement between many countries to protect highly migratory birds so that they can be protected across international boundaries.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I would venture to say that the 300 plants that are endangered are as a result of human activity. Would you agree that's true?
So directly and indirectly, yes. So the picture with plants, and this is somewhat complicated, and also we're getting a little bit outside of my area of expertise.
Okay.
I know a little I know a little bit about this because my wife works in this arena as well and is much more active in the in kind of the terrestrial ecosystem management side of things. But so we have a lot of invasive species. There's loss of
Mm.
habitat. There's due to a wide variety of human activities, and invasive species are one of the biggest issues, challenges, and biggest challenges facing the state of Hawaii today from a land and wildlife management perspective, and from a species management perspective. So you have invasive ungulates like pigs and goats and sheep that they disrupt the normal forest environment through activities like rooting and eating the native plants. And so you asked earlier in asking this question, you said, well, how does a place that is this remote have
Yes.
so many endangered species? So one of the interesting things about the Hawaiian Islands is they evolved without any major predators. So there were only two mammals in the entire originally historically there were only two mammals found in the entire Hawaiian island chain, and that was the bat and the Hawaiian monk seal, which just comes up on
Yes.
land to give birth and to rest and bask in the sun and thermoregulate. So there were no cats or dogs or pigs or goats or anything in this environment until people arrived here around 1300 years ago. And
Mm.
when Polynesian voyagers first arrived here, which we think was around 12 or 1300 years ago, they brought a few animals with them. And then when in colonial times, when Westerners started arriving here, then they brought a whole new host of invasive species with them. And some of these species have been released on purpose in
Mm.
misguided attempts to manage other invasive species. Um,
Oh, Lord.
and so
Yes.
all of these things disrupt the normal cycling. And so the animals, this is a huge challenge for example, for the birds that we work with. Many of those seabirds are ground nesting birds, nest in burrows. They did not evolve with predators like cats and the mongoose that are here. And
Mm-hmm.
so
Mm.
they really they did not develop reproductive mechanisms that would allow them to survive as a species long term in a place with those kinds of predators, with that kind of predation and pressure. And so the same thing is happening with plants, where you've got all kinds of invasive plants. You've got animals disrupting the normal cycling in the forest. You've got plants that grow much more quickly and more aggressively and outcompete the native plants.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is there's a cascade effect. And it's interesting. I actually wrote out a little idea. I wanted to work the cascade effect into this conversation,
Mm.
and kind of how an a an impact on a single species can impact many other species and really change the way an ecosystem functions and have cause great shifts in ecosystem services and functioning. But this was not how I had planned to do that at all.
Well, that's okay. I talk about cascading a lot. What I often say is that we have no idea how the changes in the light levels on the planet will cascade through our ecosystem. I think it's so interesting that you had this beautiful little island that was untouched with an ecosystem that developed on its own. And then, as you're saying, these invasive species come in and completely disrupt the balance. And what a beautiful example it is to explain that if you take one species and you pull it out or you interject it, how much this can change the balance of the entire ecosystem. So it's kind of a sad, tough lesson to learn, but it's certainly a valuable one to the rest of the world. So that's really interesting. And I was on your website learning that monk seals, there's only 1,200 monk seals left that we know of
There
on
were,
in.
I think we're around up to about 1,400 now.
Oh, that's good. So it's gone up since that
Total
video. Yeah.
throughout all of the Hawaiian Islands. So that's the main Hawaiian Islands and also the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. The Northwestern Hawaiian Islands are a very small set of islands. They have no permanent human habitation, and they are home to a wide variety of the marine-based wildlife. That's where most of the albatross nest. It's where 90% of the green sea turtles in the state nest. It
Mm.
is historic, um, where the monk seal population was highest. Um, Although prior to humans showing up, there's fairly good evidence that the monk seals were kind of distributed throughout all of the Hawaiian Islands, including the main Hawaiian Islands. And when I say main Hawaiian Islands, I'm really talking about the Hawaiian Islands that people think of when they come to visit, and you're talking about
Mm.
Oahu, Maui, Molokai, Lanai, and the big island of Hawaii. And these are the inhabited Maui. These are the
Mm.
inhabited islands, and they're the largest islands. The Northwestern Hawaiian Islands are critically important for a bunch of the wildlife that exists here. And so when we talk about, well, this is not the case for sea turtles. When we talk about species like the Hawaiian monk seal, the term we use for that is an endemic species. And so the only place in the world where Hawaiian monk seals exist is right here in Hawaii. So this is
Hmm.
the other reason that we have so many endangered species. We have a huge number of endemic species, birds,
Wow.
especially birds and plants. And so
Wow.
they don't exist anywhere else in the world. I said earlier that about 300 of the species on that endangered species list are plants here in the Hawaiian Islands. Uh, or about 200 of those, in approximately 200 of those species, there are fewer than 50 examples of that plant left in the wild that we know of.
So sad and so scary. Well, let me ask the $1 million question, which is on
Yeah,
this podcast called Starving for Darkness. How are
yeah.
you seeing the impact of light pollution on this precious ecosystem, which has so many endemic species and also, in general, endangered species on the planet?
All right. So I think let me start by talking about what we really see and kind of what our purview as an organization is. And we work primarily with marine mammals and sea turtles and seabirds. And I think the most well known classic example of the impacts of artificial lighting on wildlife are sea turtles. Everybody
Yes.
has seen the nature specials where you've got baby sea turtles emerging from the nest, and instead of going towards the water, they are wandering up on land. They're getting hit by roads. They're spending lots of time on land where they are predated upon by things like birds and crabs. They're going into parking lots. They're getting stuck in places and dying from exposure to the sun when they get dried out. They're not making it to the ocean in the first place. And that happens tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, probably millions of times each year worldwide. Um, the baby sea turtles are guided to the ocean. They hatch at night, and they are guided to the ocean by the reflection of starlight and moonlight off the ocean surface. Once they reach the ocean, they undergo this prolonged period of swimming. It lasts about 24 hours, where they basically use up all of the stored energy in their little bodies that came from the yolk in
Hmm.
that egg, and they swim out and they disappear into the open ocean for a number of years, and these are referred to as the lost years. And then they depending on the species, they either go out and roam the oceans, or in the case of green turtles, here, especially here in Hawaii, but elsewhere also. green turtles come back and they forage in the nearshore waters, and they live in the nearshore waters when they're juveniles and into early adulthood. And so we actually see those animals come back, and and so when the starlight, they nest at night. Sea turtles nest at
Mm-hmm.
night. They'll nest multiple
Mm-hmm.
times in a season, and they are guided after nesting. They're guided back into the ocean by the reflection of that moonlight on off the
Mm-hmm.
water's surface. And so not only do baby turtles get disoriented by artificial lighting, adult females who've come up to land to nest will sometimes also get impacted. And loss of baby sea turtles is tragic. The loss of an adult who has made it
Survived.
made it through and survived
Yeah.
the 15, 20, 30 years it might take to reach maturity and reproduct and become reproductive, has a
Right.
way bigger impact on the species. So they're really suffering from both ends. And those
Wow.
animals will also wander up after they'll come up on land, they'll nest, and then they'll get disoriented and attracted to bright artificial lights. And they may wander up into roads where they can be hit by car. They'll get lost or stuck, and they can die from being exposed out in the sun. Over the course of a few more days, they may be predated upon by people or
Mm-hmm.
other animals. So
It's heartbreaking.
it's heartbreaking, and one of the things I am very focused on, although I am a veterinarian and I do really genuinely care about individual animal health and welfare, at this point in my career, I am kind of weighing how effective I am and what kind of legacy I want to leave as a professional.
Mm.
And I'm focusing my energies, personally focusing my energies on, in addition to trying to address those individual animal needs, on population level questions
Mm.
and answers, and trying to provide information and support that will allow lawmakers and conservationists and natural resource managers to make really good informed decisions about how to best protect these species so that the populations can recover and they can continue to play their role in these ecosystems.
Yes. I'll admit this, that I've often used sea turtles in a way in when I'm doing grassroots education to really explain light pollution from the start. That I actually say I will not be discussing sea turtles. And it's not to say that they don't deserve the time. And I really actually want to dig in to what you're doing on sea turtles because I do care about sea turtles. My issue has been that humans only talk about sea turtles with regard to light pollution. In fact, that's the only species that's discussed, and that is mind-boggling to me because actually every species has evolved to the natural daylight cycle. So to say that only sea turtles are the species we're going to focus on doesn't make any sense to me, especially when we think of words like cascading changes throughout ecosystems. But what are you and what is the work that's being done in the Hawaiian Islands to bring the light levels down and try and make a more hospitable environment for baby sea turtles? And now I did just learn that. I didn't even think of adult sea turtles being disoriented. That's horrible to hear.
Well, so if I will definitely answer that question. I would like to provide some examples that other than sea turtles and talk about other
Great.
species
Yes.
if
Yeah,
we can do that
absolutely.
in the course of answering this question.
I'm all
So,
about it.
um, one of and again, I'm talking about the species that we actively work with that make up the majority of our activities on a daily basis. And so these are kind of dramatic examples. They're examples of things that are really easy to see that a human being can look at and go, oh, look, there's a problem. So the other thing that is a huge issue here in the Hawaiian Islands is a phenomenon called fallout. which is something we see with birds. And so seabirds come, the only time they come to land, as they come to land, when I say land, I don't mean land from flying, I mean return to the terrestrial environment. Most seabirds will spend their entire lives at sea. They never come back to land for anything other than to reproduce. Anything other than breeding and raising chicks is the only thing they come back to the land for once they reach adulthood. And then these birds spend they hatch, they spend some short amount of time here, and once they have their full feather and the ability to fly, the term for that is fledging. They leave the nest, they can fly, and they head out to the open ocean, guided by moonlight and starlight reflection off of the sea surface. They follow that light reflection out to the feeding grounds, and they don't return to land for years until they become sexually mature and come back to reproduce. So one of the things that we see every year is this phenomenon called fallout, and it most commonly occurs with a variety of different seabirds, but this also occurs with migrating birds of all species. What we see is here in the Hawaiian Islands, what we at HMAR see mostly is fallout associated with the fledging of wedgetail shearwaters here on Oahu. And so what happens is you have these baby birds that come out of the nest, they fledge, and I'd like to point out, we talked a little bit earlier about seabirds who've evolved with no predators. These wedgetail shearwaters actually nest in burrows in sandy soil, and so they nest on the ground. They come out of their nests as young birds, ready to fledge, ready to fly away. They fly away, and instead of making it to the ocean, they get attracted to lights, and they fly around and around the light until they either become completely exhausted and can no longer fly, and they become grounded, or they may collide with something like utility lines or buildings, windows, any kind of tower or like a light post, and then they end up on the ground, either injured or just completely exhausted and unable to fly. So that phenomenon is called fallout. In 2020, we rescued 209 live wedgetail shearwaters, and about 90% of those animals that fallout occur, 90% of those rescues occurred, in excess of 90% occurred during Q4. So basically between like mid to late October and mid-December, right around that fledging season. This time of year, we're heading right back into fallout season again.
And so fallout is sort of like falling out of migratory habits, would you say? Is that the derivation
they fall
of the
out
term?
Of the sky. I think it really is just identifying that they've been grounded. They've fallen out of the sky. And so this is a huge problem. This is one of multiple threats facing these species that didn't evolve in a place where there were cats or dogs or other predators or people. They've lost huge, vast amounts of habitat to develop coastal development and human activities on and around the shorelines. And this is just one more thing. So there was a really interesting study done here. The paper was just published 2020, but a graduate student. This was a graduate student project from the University of Hawaiʻi, and this student reviewed 8 years of research, 8 years of data collected on wedgetail shearwaters during fallout season. 94% of those birds that were identified were during fall, and this included both live and dead birds. 94% of those birds were recovered within 25 feet of an artificial light source.
Mm. Wow, that's an incredible statistic. Wow.
40% of that of all of the animals that fell out during those seasons, if they looked at all 8 seasons and kind of and averaged them, approximately 40% of that fallout occurred over a 3-day period surrounding the new moon,
Oh
when
my
the night
God.
sky is darkest.
Yeah. When a light could be as glary and blinding because of the contrast. So that's
Right.
so interesting, and that is definitely a fact that lighting industry folk would geek out on, because we're all about developing light levels that are about visibility, as well as the idea that contrast can serve you, but glare is not is something to avoid. So these are all things that we talk about as we design, and it's so interesting that if the backdrop of the night is with a new moon, that would cause more glare and more issues for wildlife. That's fascinating. It's also heartbreaking to hear, and I'm, it's really sad to think of all of these animals. And we are so blessed with constant food availability that we don't even think about what it would be like to forage for your fuel all every day and then have to overutilize your bodily resources, so that we may not think about an extra turn around a, a, um, a light source as being problematic, but it might actually send a bird really in the wrong direction and be utilizing really absolutely vital resources. So it's interesting to hear you talk about it in that regard. And so you do a lot of work researching fallout and trying to give this research back to other organizations. Is that true?
So actually, we as an organization collect a huge amount of data and share that data with partner organizations, collaborators, etc. My research actually focuses, interestingly enough, more on some combination of marine mammal medicine and science, but also a lot of my work has focused on metabolism and energetics. And so,
Oh,
what you
wow.
were just saying about
Yeah.
the birds, us having kind of humans having functionally, at least in many parts of the world, having
Most places,
functionally
yes.
unlimited
Yeah.
food resources. Um,
Mhm.
that's actually an incredibly important part of this conversation and this story about how seemingly invisible effects of artificial lighting may impact ecosystems through some kind of subtle energetic issues. And
Right.
so there are a couple of things I can think of as examples for this. Monk seals and turtles come out of the water, and here in Hawaii is one of the few places in the world where sea turtles will come out and lay on a beach and bask. So when they're not emerging from the ocean to nest, it's one of only a small handful of places in the world where sea turtles exhibit that behavior. Monk
Mhm.
seals also come out of the water. They come onto the beaches. They rest. All wildlife, and especially in the marine environment, everything is every animal is kind of functioning on this tight balance. It's not Disney out there. Life is
Right.
difficult, and every scrap of food, every morsel they work for. And they
Yes.
may not
Yeah.
be thinking about this the animals are probably not thinking about this in terms of energetic balance. But the difference between survival and death may be as simple as some tiny percentage of not getting enough rest, or their food not being in available, changes in food in prey availability. Wow, those animals, the food that I eat is now at 40 feet below the surface instead of 20 feet below the surface, where it's been for eons. And so there's some really interesting work that has been done in other species, in terrestrial species. And one of the other things I'd like to point out about this is, while we know a great deal, what we don't know outweighs what we do know and understand about the impacts of light, and even just the perception of light by animals. So there's very good work going on right now. There's some folks at the University of Hawaii who are researching some of the specifics about what wavelengths of light birds can see, what the impacts of that are. And this extends through all different species, both terrestrial and marine. There are some researchers some photographers, underwater photographers, videographers, filmmakers, who have developed a new blue light system that will allow them to go down and photograph, and they've discovered all kinds of things in some of the deeper layers of the ocean that have kind of not been that have been minimally explored, and they haven't seen a whole lot when exploring them, because they're using light, basically full spectrum light, when they go down looking, artificial lights when they go down looking at animals. And if you get below, I don't know, roughly call it 200 meters, there's very little light that penetrates below 200 meters, and the light that does penetrate below 200 meters is largely in the blue spectrum. And so they developed lights around that 400 nanometer spectrum, give or take about 100 nanometers, that they took down to those deeper depths, and they discovered an entirely new world of pattern and reflection on animals that they had previously not been identified. And this is only in the last 5 years or so. And this is just the ability to go, oh my God, there's a phenomenon there. This doesn't explain how it works. It doesn't explain the physiological changes that occur with exposure to light, or shifts in the daytime and nighttime patterns and in lighting patterns. This is just simply the ability to recognize, hey, there's something going on there that we were previously unaware of. And so there's a great deal of uncertainty. We are in many ways, I believe that we as a scientific community have really just scratched the surface of understanding, of being able to identify, and then taking the next step of asking the appropriate questions to understand what those interactions between light and the organism actually are, and how they affect the organism.
So what you're describing really is that there's this secret world beneath the ocean surface that is deeply connected to darkness, and that there is a wonderful amount of research that we could do to understand the amount of light that reaches those levels and the impact that it has, because it is such an untouched ecosystem. That's amazing. Did you hear of any species that are down there specifically?
No, and again, that I did not. There were a number of cartilaginous fishes, rays, sharks, jellyfish, things like that had patterns that had never been recognized or identified before. But I can't pick out a specific or single one. You mentioned this huge ecosystem. I wish I could say that it was a pristine or an untouched ecosystem. In reality, it has been heavily impacted by human activities, by fishing, by pollution, by by well,
So
by
lights on boats,
the
they're
impacts.
also.
Well, absolutely, they do have an effect, and we humans have known for hundreds or thousands of years that light impacted or had an effect on ocean-dwelling creatures. People have been using light to fish for hundreds, for sure, probably thousands of years. Um, Light is used in a wide variety of fishing activities. But if you look at, let's remember that the ocean water covers roughly 70%, a little over 70% of the Earth's
Mhm.
surface. The lights associated with even a few thousand boats are probably not enough. I can't say they're not enough. I will say
I
that they are probably not enough to cause a huge shift in on an environmental scale, on a landscape scale. However, 40% of the roughly 8 billion people on the planet live within less than 50 miles of the coastline.
Yeah, exactly.
The vast, more than 40% of the human development on the planet is within 50 miles of a coastline worldwide. Those nearshore waters, that environment, the coral reefs. So let's talk about the
Mhm.
nearshore ecosystem and the coastal ecosystem for a couple minutes. And this is actually where I was hoping to
Okay, let's dig
to
in.
I was hoping to be able to include this. So I'm really glad that we made it here. So if we look at these coastal ecosystems, they are largely kind of underpinned. The foundation of most of these coastal ecosystems is some sort of coral reef system in most of the oceans of the world. So if you're looking at Florida, around here in the Pacific, anywhere in really all oceans in that upper layer. So there's three layers in the ocean, three basic layers when we're talking about light. And you've got the euphotic layer, which is about the first 500, 600 feet of water, and sunlight can penetrate there. Then you've got a dysphotic layer, which the dysphotic zone is referred to as, interestingly enough, the twilight zone. And that
Hmm.
that is from about 200 meters to 1,000 meters. So like, 600 feet down to about 3,000 feet. And then anything below that is called the aphotic zone or the midnight zone. And I'm mentioning that because I'm going to come back to it in a few minutes when talking about my migratory patterns. So, in that euphotic zone, in that first few hundred feet of water that exists around all coastal ecosystems, coral reefs really play kind of a foundational role in supporting the normal functioning, not only of the marine ecosystem in and around the coast, but they serve critically important roles for the pelagic ocean. So these coral reefs are they're highly dependent on symbiotic relationships between things
Hmm.
um, like algae and live corals, and that both of these organisms are highly photosensitive. And so sunlight and moonlight, like the normal diurnal nocturnal dial shifts and changes, the cycles drive all of the interactions,
There's
all
a
of the symbiosis between
citation.
those.
Yeah, there's a citation that says that some aquatic species are actually sensitive to light levels less than starlight. So
Yes.
it
Oh,
it, yeah.
so all of these coral reefs are sensitive at levels, um, So again, there's a level of uncertainty here because we have not elucidated the mechanisms specifically.
Mm.
What we do know is that we can observe effects that we believe are triggered by light or lack of light, things like
Mm-hmm.
coral spawning, things like whether or not the corals unfurl the tentacles that are used, the corals and anemones unfurl the tentacles that filter food or then fold them back up so that they can, and when they fold them back up, they bring commensal algae in with them, and there's a symbiotic exchange of things like carbon. And so the the health and functioning of these reefs is kind of partially one of the major mechanisms that trigger the actions and activities um, associated with things like photosynthesis and symbiotic relationships that happen on a cellular level in very simple, basically in what, although they are animals, basically relationships between plants and animals. Underwater is light. Like they are one of the major
Yeah.
drivers is exposure to different kinds of light and that normal dial pattern of light and dark. And so these nearshore waters also serve critically important roles for, and the habitat created by these coral reefs and these protected areas are critically important for things like the baby fish that then go out into the pelagic ocean. So these fish that you
Mm-hmm.
see out in the pelagic ocean, they had to start somewhere. And while
Yeah.
some of them
It's,
breed and reproduce there, a huge number of them, the babies actually end up kind of going from microscopic organisms to few inches long in these nearshore ecosystems in places like, if you go into the Florida, in the Everglades National Park in Florida, and you go into the mangrove forests, you can see half-inch long barracuda predating on eighth-inch
wow.
long fish of other pelagic species.
It's
And
a
so
cradle for life.
absolutely. It is a cradle for life in the oceans, which supports life on land in ways that we're just beginning to understand.
Yeah. Back to that cascading term. Yes.
So
So, yeah.
with that, sorry, please go ahead.
Oh, no, go on. Go on.
Oh, so what I was going to kind of bring this back around to talk
Mm-hmm.
about how patterns, how light patterns affect behavior in animals, and it is across, and how that has impacts across ecosystem scale, ecosystem and landscape scale movement. And so remember earlier I mentioned the different layers of the
Yep.
ocean. Every 24 hours, the largest scale animal migration
Yes.
on the planet occurs in the oceans. This is and you may have, please feel free to stop me. You may have had
The
other people talk
zooplankton.
about this already.
No, please,
Yes,
please. I would love
exactly.
to hear your take on it. Yeah.
So the first thing I will say in relation to this is, again, this is not my area of expertise. I am heavily focused on individual animals of birds, dolphins and whales, sea turtles, and the medical side of managing their health and addressing stranded animals and animals that are injured or otherwise debilitated. But the underlying health, their underlying health as a species is closely tied to this stuff. So I
Yeah.
make some effort to understand it. So there is this thing called the diel vertical migration, which happens every night. So at sometime around dusk, the animals in the dysphotic or twilight zone migrate up, sometimes thousands of feet up towards the sea surface. and they may migrate up to feed, to reproduce, to digest food that in warmer waters that they may have caught or eaten in deeper, colder waters. There are all kinds of theories. And again, there's a huge amount of uncertainty around this. We really don't understand it well. We can't say this is the exact mechanism and that triggers this among all of these different species. What we do know is that every morning, every night, these animals migrate vertically and come up towards the sea surface, and at some point before dawn, they migrate back down into that
Yeah.
dysphotic or twilight zone between like
I often
500 and 3,000 feet.
Yeah, I often use the zooplankton as an example just to show the scale of species that are impacted, that it's not just, your cute sea turtles, that it's also a very tiny, often microscopic organism that's being impacted by these light levels. And what a loss it is for the ecosystem to not have that churning of nutrients. And yeah, I have the zooplankton example is a particularly scary one in my um in my research. And now I want to just jump back to what you do, because I want to give HMAR a little credit, which is that, here we are as humans on the planet, and we are having a grave impact upon all other living things. And what I see as HMAR is I feel like your work is really a nature in hospital, and a hospital, and the location is nature, as in you are actually providing emergency support for wildlife that is in desperate need, and you're saving lives and rehabilitating animals and then releasing them. And so I just want to thank you for your work, because my heart is I mean, I actually teared up watching some of the videos from your organization, because it's horrible to see how we have animals caught in fishing nets, eating plastic, and now, of course, we're hitting them with another problem such as light pollution. So I do have a question for you, though. Do you have a
Absolutely.
favorite animal, and
I
why?
do not have a favorite animal. I am so fascinated. My
Hmm.
favorite animal is whatever animal I
Hmm.
happen to be working on at that moment, and
Yeah.
trying to better understand whether I'm looking at an injury or their behavior, or trying to learn their anatomy and physiology, because I work on such a
Hmm.
diverse range of species. And so my favorite animal tends to be the thing that I'm focused on, working on, and learning the most about while I'm doing that at that moment. There is a special place in my heart for both narwhal and walrus.
Hmm.
They're fascinating animals, and I think they're really
What makes them
wildly
fascinating?
underappreciated. Well, so first off, they're cryptic. We know very little about them,
Hmm.
but what we do know about them, uh, I've had the great fortune to work with a few walrus in facilities, in zoos and aquariums, and they are just the most charismatic, charming animals to work with. Every walrus I have ever worked with had a sense of humor, and they're incredibly
Mm.
intelligent, far more
Yeah.
intelligent than we give them credit for, I think.
Oh,
And
that happens
so
all the
yeah,
time. Yeah.
yeah, it's been for me, seeing how much character they have, and how interesting they are, and how readily they engage with
Hmm.
these incredibly skilled handlers and keepers and animal behaviorists, and the husbandry folks who are caretaking for these animals do an incredible job. And it is a long, hard, often thankless job that is really, the primary reward for that is the relationship that you build with those animals.
Hmm. Now, when you've
And
done
so
emergency medicine, have you ever felt a relationship emerge with this sort of temporary connection, maybe that the animal shows you gratitude. Has there ever been a feeling like that?
No. In short, no. This is something that
Mm.
we as humans, people really want to, for whatever reason, people want to go, oh, that animal recognized that I was helping it. In my experience with the thousands of times I've gone out and worked on wildlife, on free-ranging wildlife, I'm not talking about animals in zoological collections or at aquariums where those animals are
Captive.
acclimated to human activities. They are
Hmm.
they they are able to be calm and not stressed and interact with people and develop relationships and have rewarding and fulfilling interactions with people. Free ranging wildlife is, despite what anyone wants to claim about, oh, that, I cut that animal and it came back and thanked me. Um, those animals are scared. By and large, they are petrified, especially when you start
Yeah.
talking about species that are pelagic and may have never seen a human being before.
Hmm.
Just our presence is petrifying for them. And so,
Yeah.
um, I personally don't have that sense of, oh, that animal knows I'm trying to help it. The kind of the reward that I take from that is knowing that I helped it, and I did so in a way that minimized, to the best of our ability, the stress and fear that that animal experienced while we were helping it. That's the real goal within the structure that we operate, is to minimize the
Mm.
stress on the animal and have as little impact on it as possible. And
Well,
so,
we're
um, please.
I was going to say, well, we're coming up on an hour, and I just want to say, I think there are not enough organizations that actually step into the role of wildlife protection and also emergency medicine. And so it's a very needed balance that you're at least attempting to try and counterbalance the impact that we've had. And so for every life you've rescued, thank you. I really, really appreciate it. And I also appreciate the awareness that you are raising for not only light pollution or sleep pollution or star pollution, as I want to call it, but also all types of impacts that we're having. Is there any last thing you want to leave our listeners with before we go?
Well, yeah, I would like to just take a brief moment
Yeah,
to mention a few of the things, and I know all of these things have been mentioned on here before, but I'd like to mention a few of the things that we as individuals and as communities can do to kind of minimize the impacts that we have on wildlife.
absolutely.
And so, uh, in a perfect world, I would say just shut your lights out, all of your lights out at night. Don't have street lights running. Don't, there are a number of reasons that this is not a reasonable request, but to the best of your ability, shut out your lights. Um, do your best to choose lighting that will minimize impacts on the general environment as well as on specific individual species. So, especially if you live near the coastline, but really anywhere, use lighting that is shielded, that utilizes motion sensors, so it only turns on when absolutely necessary. Pick colors and wavelengths of light that minimize the impacts on the species that are likely to be impacted in the area where you live, and that's going to be different for all different species. Um, and we're still finding out a lot about that. There's a lot of research going on about that at the
Yeah.
moment, and so stay aware, stay engaged. Try and seek out, when you're changing your bulbs out, when you're changing your fixtures out, seek out the newest information you can find when each time you go to do that, and stay informed. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, shut off your lights. Use shielded lights whenever and wherever possible. Minimize the footprint of that light and the amount of glare associated with it. And then especially during important seasonal shifts, during migratory seasons, during nesting seasons, during fledging season for birds and fallout season, just shut your lights off. It's
Yeah.
a shutting your lights off every night, all the lights on your house off every night for 2 months is a small price to pay for continuing to have the seabirds and the sea turtles and all of the incredible wildlife that both allow our ecosystems to continue functioning and having providing ecosystem services that support our life and our survival as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I always try to put a positive spin on my advice, but sometimes I'm short on patience. And was when I was actually preparing for our podcast today, I was like, somebody should buy the domain turnthedamnlightsout.com because it's kind of that simple. It can be more complicated. Someone should buy that domain because I know that someone has another campaign which is like the rent is too damn high. So in that same vein, maybe we could use a little edge to this, but I think it's really great advice. So thank you so much, Dr. Brodsky. It was wonderful to pick your brain about wildlife and all the work that you're doing. So thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It was a pleasure to be here.
Folks, I know you just fell in love with Starving for Darkness once again. Every show is such a mind blower for me, and I'm so grateful for our guests and for Jane Slade and everything, all the work she's doing and all the contributions everybody's making. But before we do, we got to go to the magicians. We got to thank them. Evluma.com. That's EVLUMA.com. Hover over products, click on dark sky friendly lighting, and let's do it. Greg, what do they got down there?
Well, with their OmniMax product, it maintains illuminance efficiently. They said that once. I'm like, that's important because, or ambiance, I should say, efficiently. Ambiance and lighting. They have the Kelvin temperatures covered, and they make it efficient by being LED. So they've got everything you need without sacrificing the light you love.
So Starving for Darkness, thanks you folks. Go to starvingfordarkness.com, but also Evluma, the magicians. That's EVLUMA.com. Come on, click it. Hover over products, click on dark sky friendly lighting, and get her done. Thanks for listening, folks.